Hollywood spent billions recreating World War II. But the rawest, most brutally honest films? Shot while the bombs were still falling. Why are these forgotten masterpieces sitting completely free on YouTube while people keep paying for the same 5 war movies? One of these films was called the greatest war film ever made by the Supreme Commander of Allied Forces. Number 14. 5 Graves to Cairo, 1943. Billy Wilder was 37 years old, a refugee who had personally fled the Nazis, and he used every ounce of that fury to make one of the cleverest espionage thrillers of the entire war. And almost nobody talks about it today. The story drops you into the North African desert, where a British corporal named Bramble stumbles into a bombed-out hotel and discovers the Nazis have been using it as an intelligence hub. He assumes the identity of a dead waiter to survive, which sounds like the setup for a comedy, except nothing about this film stays funny for long. Rommel himself shows up, played with terrifying elegance by Erich von Stroheim, and the psychological chess match between these two men is something modern spy thrillers still cannot replicate 80 years later. Here is the wild detail. Wilder based much of Rommel's characterization on the real field marshal's actual personality quirks, gathered through British military intelligence reports. Von Stroheim studied those documents obsessively for weeks, adopting specific mannerisms and speech rhythms from the reports. When the film screened for military audiences, officers who had actually faced Rommel in the field reportedly said the portrayal gave them genuine chills. That is the kind of research most directors do not attempt. The film earned 4 Academy Award nominations, including Best Picture. Critics at the time called it a superb thriller and one of the war's most genuinely intelligent films. Wilder, who would later give the world Sunset Boulevard and Some Like It Hot, always said this was his most personal wartime statement because he had something deeply personal to prove. It is sitting on YouTube right now, completely free, and it plays better than most spy films produced in the last 2 decades. Do not skip this one. Number 13. Action in the North Atlantic, 1943. Humphrey Bogart spent a lot of World War II making wartime films for Warner Brothers, but this one does not feel like propaganda, because it is absolutely, ferociously relentless from the first frame. The film follows the Merchant Marine, the branch of American service that history keeps forgetting, but that literally delivered the fuel, food, ammunition, and weapons that kept Allied forces alive throughout the entire war. Bogart plays Joe Rossi, a first mate on a tanker crossing the Atlantic, and the film does not waste time pretending the ocean is safe. Within the first 15 minutes, a German submarine destroys the ship, and the crew fights for survival in burning water. The film drops you into chaos and never fully lets you breathe again. What makes this one genuinely special is the scale of commitment. Warner Brothers built massive water tank sets to film the ocean sequences, spending an extraordinary amount for the era. Director Lloyd Bacon and his crew spent weeks shooting ship sinkings and explosive sequences that look startlingly real, even today. The Merchant Marine suffered a higher casualty rate per capita than any other branch of the American military during the war, and this film was the first major Hollywood production to actually acknowledge their sacrifice in full. The real wild detail: the Soviet Union specifically requested prints of this film to boost morale among their own naval forces. It was shown to Red Navy sailors and reportedly received standing receptions at screenings in Moscow. That is not something Hollywood war films accomplish regularly or easily. Bogart gives a genuinely underrated performance here, quieter and more grounded than his usual roles. Critics called it a thundering sea story. If you care about forgotten American heroes and brilliant practical filmmaking, this one belongs on your screen tonight. Number 12. Guadalcanal Diary, 1943. This film went into production while the Battle of Guadalcanal was still happening. Let that fact fully land. Marines were fighting and dying on that island, while Hollywood was already dramatizing it for paying audiences. Based on the best-selling first-hand account by war correspondent Richard Tregaskis, Guadalcanal Diary was one of the first American films to show the Pacific War as something genuinely brutal rather than a clean, triumphant adventure. The film follows a group of Marines from their transport ship through the savage jungle fighting on the island, and it does not pretend the enemy is incompetent or the outcome guaranteed. It treats the audience like adults who can handle uncertainty. The cast includes William Bendix in one of his finest performances, playing a Brooklyn cab driver who finds himself fighting in conditions no human being was built for. His character brings a working-class authenticity to the film that gives it an emotional core, missing from more polished studio productions of the same era. The genuinely remarkable production detail here is the timeline. 20th Century Fox rushed this film into theaters while the actual campaign was still being covered in newspapers and radio broadcasts. Audiences were watching dramatized versions of battles that soldiers were still fighting on the other side of the world. The film became a massive commercial hit, helping shift American public perception of the Pacific Theater from a distant concern into something viscerally urgent and personal. Critics gave it strong reviews, with many noting that it treated soldiers as real human beings rather than symbols or recruitment posters. The U.S. Marine Corps promoted the film aggressively as a morale builder. Some veterans who actually served on Guadalcanal later said the film captured the exhaustion and disorientation of jungle combat better than they expected from any Hollywood production. It is free, it is tense, and it was made with an urgency you can still feel. Number 11. Bataan, 1943. MGM made this film about the most catastrophic American military defeat of the Pacific War, and somehow turned it into one of the most gripping last-stand stories ever committed to celluloid. The Battle of Bataan ended in the largest surrender of American forces in history, with tens of thousands of soldiers becoming prisoners who then endured the infamous Death March across the Philippine Peninsula. This is not a victory story. It is a film about men fighting a rearguard action they know they cannot win, buying time with their lives so other forces can regroup and survive. The film does not flinch from that reality or dress it up in false hope. Robert Taylor leads a racially diverse unit, which was genuinely radical for 1943 American cinema. The squad includes Filipino, Black, and Latino soldiers fighting alongside white Americans at a time when Hollywood almost never showed integrated fighting units in any serious dramatic context. The film presented this as simply the reality of combat, without speech-making or commentary, and that quiet statement was more powerful than any monologue could have been. The most arresting detail, The film ends with Taylor alone, the last man standing in his squad, continuing to fire his machine gun at an advancing enemy force that will clearly and inevitably overwhelm him. The camera slowly pulls back as he keeps firing. No rescue arrives, no cavalry appears. Just a man choosing how to meet his end on his own terms. Audiences in 1943 were shaken. Some theaters reportedly had to pause screenings because viewers were too emotional to sit through the final minutes. Critics recognized it immediately as something different. It was called stark, grim, and honest, and one of the toughest war pictures ever made. Director Tay Garnett shot it almost entirely on studio sets, using fog and shadow to create an atmosphere of inevitability that is genuinely haunting even now. Number 10, Destination Tokyo, 1943. Cary Grant on a submarine sounds like a guaranteed crowd pleaser, and it absolutely is, but this film is also significantly stranger and more daring than its glamorous cast would suggest. Grant plays Captain Cassidy, commander of the submarine USS Copperfin, sent on a secret mission into Tokyo Bay to gather meteorological data that will be used to plan the Doolittle raid. The mission requires the crew to navigate minefields, evade depth charges, outmaneuver Japanese destroyers on the open water, and perform an emergency appendectomy using only instructions from a medical textbook. That last element actually happened in real life aboard submarines during the war, and Warner's insisted on including it because the story was too extraordinary to cut. Director Delmer Daves spent weeks consulting with actual Submarine 8 commanders to get the operational details right. He filmed aboard a genuine submarine wherever possible, and the claustrophobia is real and palpable throughout. Every creak of the hull, every depth charge explosion, every moment of absolute silence feels lived in rather than staged. The wild cultural detail. This film released just 2 years after Pearl Harbor and played in packed theaters across America. The scene where the crew discovers a Japanese pilot carrying photographs of his family back home in California was reportedly met with complete sustained silence in theaters, followed by emotional discussions in the lobbies afterward. Audiences did not expect a wartime film to briefly humanize anyone on the opposing side, and many did not know how to process it. The film was also used as official Navy recruitment material and shown to actual submarine crews before deployment. Several veterans later said it was surprisingly accurate about life below the waterline. It earned nearly $5 million at the box office, an enormous figure for its era. Grant brings unexpected gravity to every single scene. Number 9, 30 Seconds Over Tokyo, 1944. The title tells you exactly what the film is about, and it is still not enough preparation for how emotionally devastating it actually becomes by the time the credits roll. This is the story of the Doolittle raid, the 1942 bombing of Tokyo that was the first American offensive strike on the Japanese homeland. The raid accomplished relatively modest military results, but was psychologically enormous for an American public still reeling from Pearl Harbor and desperate for evidence that the war could actually be fought back. Spencer Tracy plays Jimmy Doolittle with characteristic, grounded understatement, but the film truly belongs to Van Johnson as Pilot Ted Lawson, whose first-hand account formed the basis of the script. What separates this from standard wartime propaganda is the unsparing second half, which refuses to sanitize what happens to Lawson after his plane goes down. He suffers severe injuries requiring the amputation of his leg, and the film does not cut away or rush through his recovery. It sits with the physical pain, the grief, the difficult adjustment, and the honest conversations he has with his wife about identity and the future. For a 1944 studio production, this was genuinely confrontational filmmaking about what war costs individuals. Director Mervyn LeRoy worked directly with Doolittle's actual raiders during production and had access to military equipment and personnel. Some of the men who flew the original mission appear in background roles, and that authenticity is visible in how the cockpit and flying sequences carry real weight. The film earned tremendous critical praise, with the New York Times calling it a superb human document of war. It received several Oscar nominations and became one of the highest-grossing films of 1944. Real amputees who saw the film reportedly wrote to the studio, saying the portrayal of recovery was the first honest representation of their experience they had ever seen on screen. Number 8. The Immortal Sergeant, 1943. Henry Fonda plays a coward in a war movie, and that single creative choice makes this film more interesting than 90% of everything else in the genre. Corporal Colin Spence is not the soldier you want beside you in the North African desert. He is hesitant, overly thoughtful, constantly second-guessing himself while louder, more confident men lead the charge without looking back. When the sergeant who holds the unit together is killed early in the film, Spence becomes the ranking soldier left, and nobody, including Spence himself, considers this a good development for anyone involved. The film then becomes something genuinely unusual, a war movie about the psychological weight of reluctant leadership, about discovering a capacity for command you never believed you possessed. It is based on a novel by Canadian author John Brophy, and director John M. Stahl resisted considerable studio pressure to make Spence more conventionally heroic. What remains on screen is a portrait of an ordinary man finding a version of himself he did not know existed, which is a significantly more realistic depiction of how people actually function under extreme pressure than the typical Hollywood warrior narrative ever allowed. The genuinely surprising detail. Fonda was nearly 40 when he made this film, past typical military service age, and he insisted on doing the physical sequences himself, training extensively in desert warfare tactics and physical conditioning to be completely credible in the role. His commitment sold audiences on a character who might otherwise have seemed too passive to care about. Critics admired the film's deliberate restraint. Bosley Crowther in the New York Times wrote that it was remarkably free of the conventional heroics that made so many war films of its era feel hollow and interchangeable. It is quietly influential on later filmmakers who wanted to explore the internal landscape of soldiers rather than just the external spectacle of combat. Number 7. The North Star, 1943. Dana Andrews, Ann Baxter, Walter Houston, and Erich von Stroheim in a story about a Ukrainian village resisting the Nazi invasion, written by Lillian Hellman and produced by Samuel Goldwyn. This should be a landmark classic. Instead, it became a political scandal that buried the film for 3 decades. The North Star is a striking film about ordinary Soviet citizens fighting back against a horrifying occupation. The village sequences before the invasion are warm and almost idyllic, which makes the violence of the German arrival land with real physical force. Von Stroheim plays a Nazi doctor conducting medical experiments on children in the village, and his performance is among the most quietly unsettling in all of wartime cinema, because he plays the character as calm, reasonable, and professionally dedicated rather than cartoonishly monstrous. The film received 6 Academy Award nominations, including Best Picture. Critics called it magnificent and a brave and beautiful film. And then the Cold War arrived and changed everything. By the early 1950s, making a film that portrayed Soviet citizens as heroic and sympathetic was politically toxic in McCarthy-era Hollywood. The film was cut, re-edited, and re-released under the title Armored Attack, with new framing designed to completely recontextualize its message. Key scenes were removed. The original version was effectively suppressed from public view. The genuinely shocking detail, Lillian Hellman, who wrote the screenplay, was later subpoenaed by the House Un-American Activities Committee partly because of this film. She refused to cooperate, delivering her famous statement about not cutting her conscience to fit that year's fashions. The film's artistic reputation became a direct casualty of American political anxiety. The original cut is on YouTube right now. Watching it is an act of genuine film archaeology, recovering something that was deliberately buried. Number 6. The Purple Heart, 1944. This film is based on a real event that the U.S. military tried to keep classified, and 20th Century Fox released it to the public anyway. That alone makes it worth watching. After the Doolittle Raiders were shot down over China, several airmen were captured by Japanese forces. The Japanese government put 8 of them on trial in what was internationally condemned as a show trial with a predetermined verdict. The men were found guilty of bombing civilian targets and sentenced harshly. The specific details of what happened to the men during captivity were largely suppressed by American military authorities who feared the information would damage home front morale at a critical moment in the war. Dana Andrews leads the cast as Captain Harvey Ross, the senior officer among the captured airmen who refuses under sustained pressure to reveal how their mission was organized or where their carrier launched from. The film does not soften or romanticize what happens to these men as a consequence of their refusal. Director Louis Milestone, who had earlier directed All Quiet on the Western Front, brought an unflinching quality to the material that the studio reportedly found deeply uncomfortable at several points. Scenes were cut under pressure before release, but what remains in the final film is still extraordinary and genuinely challenging. The remarkable detail, the courtroom trial sequences are conducted with a legal precision that makes them horrifying rather than theatrical. The Japanese prosecutors in the film are depicted not as raging villains, but as coldly efficient legal operators working within a corrupt system they have built specifically for this purpose. For 1944, Hollywood, that level of restraint was almost radical. Critics admired it enormously, calling it one of the most powerful and moving films of the war. The men it depicted were still in captivity when it opened, watching it, knowing that changes everything. Number 5. Edge of Darkness, 1943. Errol Flynn was the biggest action star in Hollywood in 1943, and this film, which almost nobody discusses today, was used as a recruitment tool by actual Norwegian resistance networks operating under Nazi occupation. That is not a detail most films can claim. The story is set in a small Norwegian fishing village under German occupation. When a Nazi officer is found dead and the entire village is mysteriously, collectively silent, the film unfolds in flashback, revealing how the whole community organized a coordinated armed uprising. Flynn plays Gunnar Brogue, the resistance leader, alongside Ann Sheridan and Walter Houston, both of whom deliver exceptional work that the film's obscurity has allowed history to forget. What makes Edge of Darkness genuinely distinct is its treatment of collaboration and resistance as community-wide moral choices rather than individual acts of spectacular heroism. The film spends real time with villagers who accommodate the occupation out of fear or pragmatic survival instinct, and it refuses to rush to condemn them. The moral complexity is handled with a maturity that few studio wartime productions ever attempted. Director Louis Milestone, who also directed The Purple Heart and All Quiet on the Western Front, had an extraordinary gift for grounding large spectacle in precise human behavior. And the film's climax, a full-scale village uprising, is emotionally earned in ways that studio battle sequences rarely are. The wild detail, Norwegian exile communities in Britain and the United States organized special screenings and incorporated the film into recruitment materials for active resistance networks. Real Norwegians fighting the occupation embraced it as a dramatized document of their actual struggle against an overwhelming force. Flynn, frequently dismissed as a lightweight who coasted on his looks, delivers one of his most committed and serious performances. Watch this tonight. Number 4. Wake Island, 1942. This film was made so fast it was practically still smoking from production. Paramount rushed it into theaters literally 8 months after the actual battle ended, and it collected 4 Academy Award nominations, including Best Picture. That is one of the most extraordinary production stories in Hollywood history. The Battle of Wake Island in December 1941 was one of the first military engagements following Pearl Harbor. A small garrison of Marines, civilian construction workers, and Navy personnel held the island against a vastly superior Japanese invasion force for 16 days before being overwhelmed. It became an immediate national symbol of American defiance in the darkest early weeks of the Pacific War, when almost every news bulletin brought a new catastrophe. Brian Donlevy plays Major Caton, commanding a defense that everyone in the film knows is ultimately hopeless. William Bendix is extraordinary as a wisecracking Marine whose dark humor becomes the film's unexpected emotional anchor. Director John Farrow shot the entire production in just over a month, using actual Marines as technical advisors and extras throughout. And the result carries an authenticity that more leisurely productions sometimes never achieve. The genuinely stunning detail. Some of the Marines who survived Wake Island and were taken prisoner were still in Japanese captivity when audiences watched their story on American cinema screens. Families of the defenders saw this film in theaters while their loved ones were still officially listed as missing in action. The emotional weight in those theaters must have been extraordinary. Despite its speed of production, the craftsmanship is completely real. The New York Times called it a stirring document of the war. It was the second highest grossing film of 1942. 4 Oscar nominations for a film assembled in weeks. That kind of creative urgency produces a specific electricity you can still feel. Number 3. Corvette K, 225, 1943. Almost nobody talks about this film, which means almost nobody knows they are missing one of the most technically authentic naval films produced during the entire war era, starring Randolph Scott doing the finest work of his career to that point. K-225 is a corvette, a small and fast escort vessel used by the Royal Canadian Navy to protect Allied convoys crossing the North Atlantic. The Battle of the Atlantic was the longest continuous military campaign of the entire war, running from 1939 to 1945 without pause, costing thousands of Allied lives and appearing on American cinema screens almost not at all. This film goes directly there, to the cold gray water and the permanent dread of what swims beneath it. Scott plays Lieutenant Commander McLean, the captain of the K-225, navigating the sustained terror of anti-submarine warfare on the open Atlantic through bitter winter conditions. What separates this film from similar productions is the depth of actual Royal Canadian Navy cooperation behind it. Real corvettes were used throughout filming. Real naval personnel appear in supporting roles. The operational procedures shown are genuinely accurate to real convoy protection doctrine. Producer Howard Hawks, who later directed Sergeant York and The Big Sleep, insisted on this authenticity because his brother had served in the Navy. He wanted the film to feel like a direct report from the water rather than a studio interpretation of distant events, and he succeeded in a way that most naval films of the era simply do not. The remarkable detail: the film was shown to actual corvette crews in training programs and reportedly used as instructional material because its depiction of convoy procedures was considered accurate enough to have genuine training value. A dramatic film that doubled as a naval manual. That happens almost never. Reviewers praised its realism and controlled excitement. Scott is commanding and completely understated. The gray ocean sequences communicate danger better than any explosion sequence ever could. Number 2. Sahara, 1943. Here is the argument for Sahara being one of the greatest World War II films ever made. A film most people under 40 have never seen, sitting completely free on YouTube right now, waiting for anyone willing to look. Humphrey Bogart plays Sergeant Joe Gunn, commanding a broken-down American tank in the Libyan desert after his unit is overrun by advancing German forces. He picks up stragglers as he retreats across the sand, an improbable collection of British, French, Sudanese, and South African soldiers, along with a captured Italian officer and a German prisoner of war. They are searching desperately for water with an entire German battalion closing in from behind. Director Zoltan Korda creates something genuinely extraordinary from what should be a simple setup. The desert itself becomes a character, relentless and completely indifferent to human allegiance or ideology. The diverse group of soldiers is handled with a sophistication that 1943 Hollywood almost never achieved. The Sudanese soldier Tambul, played by Rex Ingram, is given a full interior life and a heroic story arc at a time when black characters in Hollywood films were almost exclusively relegated to comic relief roles with no agency whatsoever. The wild detail: Columbia Pictures licensed the film's story and basic structure to be remade as an Italian production in 1945, then again as an American film in the 1990s, starring James Belushi. Neither remake came remotely close to the original. The 1943 version was also adapted into a Soviet stage production performed for Red Army troops during the war itself. Bogart called it one of his personal favorites from this entire period of his career. The ending, where an exhausted and outnumbered group turns its tactical defeat into a complete psychological victory over a superior force, is one of the most satisfying conclusions in war cinema history. The New York Times called it a taut, exciting, and intelligently handled film. Watch this one first. Number 1, The Story of G.I. Joe, 1945. This is the film that Dwight D. Eisenhower called the greatest war film he had ever seen. Not one of the greatest, the greatest, full stop. And it has been slowly disappearing from public consciousness for 80 years. The Story of G. 1-1 Joe is built directly on the war journalism of Ernie Pyle, the most beloved war correspondent in American history, a man who lived alongside infantrymen in the mud of Italy and North Africa, and wrote about them not as warriors or symbols, but as exhausted, cold, frightened human beings doing an impossible job for reasons they could barely articulate. The film follows the soldiers he wrote about through the Italian campaign, with Burgess Meredith playing Pyle himself with a quiet, devastating accuracy that never feels like performance. Robert Mitchum, in the role that made him a legitimate star, plays Lieutenant Walker, an officer whose evolution from a tough and capable sergeant to a weary, almost broken leader becomes the film's true emotional spine. Mitchum was 27 years old and had never carried a major film before this one. He carries this one with complete authority. Director William Wellman spent months embedded with actual combat infantrymen before filming began. He refused studio interference at every turn. He shot in conditions designed to genuinely match what the soldiers had experienced, using combat veterans as technical advisors and incorporating real footage from the Italian campaign directly into the final cut. The result is unlike any other war film of its era. The detail that quietly destroys you. Ernie Pyle was killed by Japanese fire in the Pacific just weeks before this film was released in theaters. The studio added a simple dedication title card at the opening. When actual combat soldiers watched the film at its premiere and at subsequent screenings, many of them reportedly wept, not at the dramatic climactic moments, but at small mundane details. The way men sleep in their helmets, the way they talk about nothing important, the way exhaustion actually looks on a human face. Pyle had written that the infantry soldier was the least glamorized figure of the entire war, and this film is his monument to them. 5 soldiers from the actual units Pyle had written about attended the premiere. 3 of them could not finish watching it. Robert Mitchum received his only Academy Award nomination for this role, and most film scholars consider the lack of a win one of the great Oscar injustices. The film was considered lost for years before being preserved and uploaded to YouTube, where it sits right now, free, waiting for anyone willing to give it 90 minutes. It is the greatest World War II film that history simply forgot to keep famous, and that is an injustice worth correcting tonight. 14 films, all free, all sitting on YouTube while people pay streaming subscriptions for the same recycled war epics they have already seen 3 times. Drop a comment right now and tell me which of these you have actually seen and which one hit you hardest. And here is the argument I want you to fight about in the comments. The films made during the war, with real urgency and genuine fear behind every frame, are more honest about what war actually is than anything made with modern budgets, perfect hindsight, and digital effects. Prove me wrong.